low shape of pale rock rises from flat water. It sits in the Aegean Sea among the other islands of the Cyclades, but it is smaller than most of them, a narrow, limestone-backed place with no great height and no deep harbor. Its shore the color of dry bone where it meets the water, and a bleached salt kept gray above that. In the late afternoon, when the sun comes in from the west across the open sea, the whole island seems to hold the light differently from the water around it, catching it and releasing it slowly, the way pale stone does when it has been warm all day and the warmth is just beginning to leave. There is wind here most of the time. The sound of it over bare rock is particular, not the sound of wind over grass or over the branches of trees, but a clean, low, continuous sound, like something very old moving quietly past. The island is Delos. An ancient sailor approaching it from the east would have seen it from a distance as a thin horizontal mark on the water before it became anything more than that, a line between the sea and the sky that gradually resolved itself into a shoreline, a ridge, the shapes of what were built there over the centuries of its great sacred use. Before any of that was built, before any of the temples and colonnades and sacred precincts that would eventually make Delos one of the most visited places in the Greek world, the island was known chiefly for this, that something extraordinary had happened here at the edge of the known world, in the shallow water of the Aegean, before memory could measure it. The tradition holds that Delos was not always fixed. In the oldest accounts of the island's nature, it was understood to have been a floating, drifting landmass, unanchored to the seabed, moving through the sea without a stable position, one of the places in the Greek world that had not yet settled into its permanent form. The word the ancient sources use for this quality suggests something almost restless about it, a piece of the world not yet committed to being where it was. When ancient writers described it this way, they were not speaking loosely. This was the theological status of the island, unstable, unmoored, without the solidity that most land possessed. And the question that the myth preserves, in the way myths preserve questions by turning them into events, is how that changed. What fixed Delos to the floor of the sea? What arrived on this drifting, salt-pale shore and made it still? The account that answers this is preserved in the Homeric hymn to Apollo, one of the longest and most carefully composed of the ancient hymns addressed to the god born on this island, and in the work of the poet Callimachus, who wrote in the 3rd century BCE, and whose hymn to Artemis is one of the most detailed ancient sources for the early life of the goddess. What both accounts hold, in their different ways and with their different emphases, is this: before the twins were born, a goddess came to Delos in great difficulty, and the island received her, and was fixed in the receiving. The goddess was Leto. She was, in the understanding of the Greek tradition, the daughter of Titans, figures of an earlier divine generation, figures of a world that predated the Olympian order, and she had come to be carrying the children of Zeus. That she was carrying them was known. That they would be among the most significant of all the Olympian deities was understood, in the way that myth understands such things from the inside out, as something the world arranged around. The difficulty was this, that Hera, the wife of Zeus, had forbidden every land on earth from receiving Leto while she labored. The Homeric hymn to Apollo preserves this detail specifically. Hera's prohibition was comprehensive, reaching every place that was fixed and known, every shore and valley and mountain that could be named as belonging somewhere. No land that stood beneath the sky and knew itself as land would shelter her. What Hera also did in the account of the hymn was to hold the goddess of childbirth on Olympus. Her name was Eileithyia, and her function was precisely what her presence provided: the facilitation of birth, the help that a laboring woman, human or divine, required. By keeping Eileithyia on Olympus, away from Delos, away from Leto, Hera extended the suffering not by any act of violence, but simply by an absence, by the withdrawal of the one presence that could resolve what was happening into its natural completion. Leto labored on. Days passed. The tradition does not give a number, but the sense it carries is of a very long time, of effort sustained past any ordinary limit, of a goddess who had run out of shore. None of this, told at this remove, carries the weight of immediate crisis. These are events that happened at the beginning of things, in the time before time had settled into the shape it would hold through the rest of the tradition's unfolding. The outcome is already known. It is the starting point for everything that followed. What the myth is doing in preserving Hera's prohibition and the imprisonment of Eileithyia is establishing the specific texture of difficulty that preceded the birth of the twins, so that what they became could be understood as something that arrived against resistance, that was wanted badly enough to be arranged for against great opposition. Divine figures in the Greek tradition are not simply born. The circumstances of their arrival mean something. The other Olympian goddesses understood what was needed. The Homeric hymn to Apollo describes them gathered in awareness of Leto's situation, and among them there moved a decision, quiet, collective, the kind of decision that the tradition attributes to women acting together when formal authority has been used against something that ought not to be obstructed. They sent Iris to bring Eileithyia to Delos, and to persuade her they offered a gift. What they offered was a necklace. It was made of golden amber, 9 cubits long, the hymn specifies, which is a length worth imagining for a moment, and it was threaded on golden wire, and it passed between the goddesses, bead by bead, its warmth caught in the light of wherever they were, before it was carried as the price of a birth that had been waiting too long. A necklace of golden amber, 9 cubits long, moving between the hands of goddesses. The image has the quality that small details in very old stories often carry when they have been preserved for a specific reason. It is particular in the way that real things are particular. It has a material weight. It catches light. Its amber would have been Baltic amber in the understanding of the ancient Greek world, the yellow gold resin that came from far in the north and arrived in the Mediterranean through long chains of trade, already ancient by the time it was worn, already old when it was new. The necklace went to Eileithyia, and Eileithyia came to Delos, and the Homeric hymn records that the moment she stepped onto the shore, the labor began to move toward its conclusion. The account in Callimachus is somewhat different in certain of its specifics, and the differences are worth holding alongside the earlier version rather than replacing it. Callimachus, writing in the 3rd century BCE, was a scholar as well as a poet, a man who had access to the library at Alexandria, and who brought to his hymns a quality of attention to variant tradition that makes them particularly useful as records of what was believed. His hymn to Artemis is addressed to the goddess directly and describes her childhood in detail, her early visits, her requests of her father, the specific provisions of her divine establishment, and it opens with Artemis already born, already a figure with desires and purposes of her own, seated on the knee of Zeus and asking for what she wants. But the account that concerns Delos and the birth comes through Callimachus's hymn to Delos, as well as through his hymn to Artemis, and what Callimachus preserves about the moment of the birth itself is this: Artemis came first. Of the 2 divine twins, Artemis arrived before Apollo, and having arrived, having been, moments before, not yet in the world, she turned almost immediately to assist her mother. She served, in those first moments of her existence, as midwife to Leto. The Callimachus account makes of this an image of the goddess's essential nature, that from the very first instant of her divine life, she was already organized toward a particular kind of help, already oriented toward the labor of the world around her, rather than toward her own comfort or circumstance. The ground beneath Leto at this moment, in the account as it settles in the imagination, is the warm pale limestone of the Aegean shore, not the polished stone of a built sanctuary, but the raw sun-held stone of the island as it was before anything was built, rough at the edge where it met the water, smoothed in the places where generations of tide had worked it, warm with the accumulated heat of a long Aegean afternoon, even as the light was beginning to shift toward evening. The sound of the sea would have continued beneath everything, as it always continues, the wind over bare rock. And on this ground, on this specific island that had been floating and was now stopped, the two figures who would define so much of what the Greek tradition held most important were born, one after the other, the elder already helping as the younger arrived. The question of why Delos became fixed at this moment is one the tradition answers by implication rather than statement. A place that receives something of sufficient weight is anchored by the receiving. The island had accepted what no other shore would accept, had offered itself as ground when every other ground had been forbidden, and the consequence of that acceptance was that it became permanent. It was not a reward exactly. It was more like a natural result. A place that has been the site of something that's significant does not remain adrift. The myth does not labor the point. It simply records that afterward Delos was fixed, and the fixing coincided with the birth, and the birth coincided with the island's willingness to receive what it received. The palm tree under which Leto labored, in some versions of the account, remained on the island as a sacred marker for centuries. Ancient travelers to Delos reported seeing it, or what was understood to be it, a tree that had been there since the beginning of the island's sacred history, and that stood in the sanctuary as a physical remainder of the event that had made Delos what it was. Whether it was in any botanical sense the same tree is a question of a different kind than the tradition was asking. What mattered was that something stood in that place and pointed back to that moment, that the island carried within its geography the evidence of what had happened there, the way all sacred landscapes in the Greek world were understood to carry the evidence of the divine events that had shaped them. Artemis, then, arrived into a world that was still settling. The island was new to its anchorage. The tradition around the birth was still in the process of becoming what it would be, and the first thing the goddess did, in the version that Callimachus preserves, was turn outward rather than inward, was orient herself toward someone else's need before her own situation had fully registered. This quality will hold through the whole of what she becomes. It is not a secondary thing about her. It is the first thing. What she became in the years of her divine childhood begins to take shape in the account that Callimachus gives of the young goddess seated on the knee of Zeus. The image is domestic in a way that the later myths about Artemis rarely are. A small figure on a large lap, close and unguarded, in the position of a child with a parent who is paying attention. Zeus, in this account, is not the remote administrative authority of the Olympian order, but simply a father in the presence of a daughter he is fond of, willing to listen, inclined toward generosity. The Greek tradition had room for this version of Zeus, alongside the more formal one, and Callimachus used it. Artemis asked for things. She asked, and the asking was specific, not vague desires or general wishes, but a precise and careful list of provisions for the life she already knew she was going to live. The first thing she asked for was perpetual virginity. Not youth, not beauty, not the particular gifts that other goddesses held, but the permanent condition of being unmarried, unbeholden, not given over. The Greek word the tradition uses, parthenos, carries with it not merely the physical sense, but the fuller sense of a person who has not been incorporated into the social structures that marriage in the ancient world entailed, who remains, in a specific and ongoing way, her own. Artemis asked for this not as an absence, but as a positive condition, as the state she wanted to inhabit permanently, and Zeus granted it. She asked for a silver bow and arrows to match her brother's, and for this too she was given her wish. The bow would become her most persistent emblem, the thing by which she was recognized across centuries of representation in art and literature, the object most immediately associated with her name. But in the moment of the asking, it is simply a tool, something a hunter needs, no more dramatic than that. She wanted what she needed to do the work she had already decided to do, and she asked for it plainly. She asked for a short tunic, the hunting dress that would allow her to move freely through terrain that a longer garment would obstruct. She asked that all the mountains of the world be given to her as her domain. In the geography of the ancient world, this was a very large thing to ask for. The mountains were not peripheral to the inhabited landscape, but were its defining edges, the places where the human world ran out and something else began. Artemis asked for all of them. The request was not modest. It was made by someone who understood the scale of what she was proposing and proposed it anyway, already knowing it was right. She asked for 60 oceanid nymphs as her companions in the hunt, young women, daughters of the god of the world Ocean, who would run beside her and share the life she was planning, and she asked for 20 Amnesian nymphs as her handmaidens, drawn from the region around the Amnisos River in Crete, whose task would be the more particular domestic work of the hunt, the care of the hounds, the looking after of sandals and hunting gear, the practical attending to what a life lived entirely outdoors requires. All of these companions would hold the same vow that the goddess herself held. They would be, in that sense, a community organized around the same refusal, the refusal to be anything other than what they had chosen to be. Beyond these things, she asked for 30 cities to be given as her own, and the guardianship of all roads and harbors. These were not hunting places, they were the infrastructure of the human world, the nodes and pathways of the civilization that the Greek tradition understood itself as inhabiting. Artemis, asking for them, was not asking to remain entirely in the wild. She was asking for a purchase on the world that would be hers to hold and tend, a set of responsibilities that extended her authority out from the mountains and forests and into the places where people lived and moved and arrived from journeys over water. Zeus, in the account Callimachus gives, was pleased by the asking. He did not merely grant what was requested, but added to it. The 30 cities were part of his addition, as was the guardianship of harbors and roads, provisions that went beyond what the young goddess had thought to claim for herself. The image here is of a father who has been presented with a set of wishes by a child who clearly knows her own mind and who is moved by the knowing to give more than was asked. The tradition is not presenting Zeus in this moment as a figure of political authority, ratifying a distribution of divine responsibility. It is presenting him as pleased, as the specific pleasure a parent takes in seeing a child who is already becoming what they will be. The moment the grant was made, something had settled, not into stone, not with the quality of something fixed against its will, or finished before it was ready, but with the quality of a thing that has found its proper shape and rested there. Artemis had asked for what she needed. She had received it, and more. The discussion was complete. What the tradition preserves next, what the imagination following the story naturally moves to, is the image of the goddess turning away, not dramatically, not in any gesture of departure that required marking, simply the way attention turns when the present moment has given everything it has, and the next moment is already somewhere else. Artemis, on the knee of Zeus, or just descended from it, was already somewhere in the mountains she had just been given. The conversation had happened in some high Olympian space, in the formal dignity of the divine assembly, or perhaps in a more private corner of it, and the goddess's mind was ahead of her body, was already in the high places, in the forested upper slopes, and the bare ridges above the tree line, in the stone passes, and the cold morning air of the heights she now held in her care. The mountains of the Greek world are not abstract. They are specific ranges with specific characters. The white limestone of Taygetos, rising above the Eurotas Valley, the densely forested slopes of the Arcadian interior, the bare and windswept peaks of the mountains of the north that the Greeks called by names that still belong to them. Artemis, turning toward them before she had even fully left the company of the gods, was turning toward something real, toward a landscape that existed in the world the Greeks inhabited, visible from their towns and their harbors, accessible by paths they had walked for generations. The mountains were not a metaphor for distance from the human world. They were the actual high ground above the actual valleys, and the goddess who now held them moved through them as through territory she had always known. The 60 Oceanid nymphs and the 20 Amnesian handmaidens were part of the life she was turning toward. They would come in time, gathered, chosen, bound by the same vow and the same commitment to the life that Artemis had requested. But in this first moment after the granting, before anything has been assembled, the image the tradition holds is of the goddess alone in her orientation, already attending to the mountains in her mind, while her body was still in the company of the divine assembly. Zeus had given her 30 cities. The number is specific in Callimachus, and the specificity matters, not a vague plurality of cities, not a general authority over human settlements, but 30, a bounded, particular provision. And alongside the cities, the harbors and roads, the infrastructure of arrival and passage and departure. In the Greek world, a harbor was the place where the world opened outward, where ships came in and where ships left, where strangers arrived and where familiar things departed into the unknown. A road was the line between one known place and another, carrying everything that needed to move between them. To hold authority over harbors and roads was to hold authority over the edges of the known world as it pressed against what lay beyond it. A responsibility entirely appropriate for a goddess who was herself a figure of edges, of the places where the human and the wild met and were governed by different rules. The island of Delos, behind her now in the imagination of the story, still sat in its flat sea, the Aegean in the afternoon light, the pale stone of the shore, the water around the island still and deeply blue, holding its new stillness, its fixed position in the seabed, as if it had always been exactly here and had never drifted at all. The amber necklace was somewhere among the gods, and Aletheia had returned to Olympus, or wherever the goddess of childbirth held her station between the times when she was needed. The palm tree stood in the place where it would stand for centuries. What had been accomplished on Delos was not merely the arrival of 2 divine figures into the world. It was the creation of the specific conditions under which those figures would become what they were going to be. The circumstances of difficulty and assistance and the willingness of one small unstable island to receive what no other shore would take. The birth of Artemis on Delos was not the end of the island's sacred story. It was the beginning of the story that would draw thousands of visitors across the subsequent centuries, that would make the island one of the most important religious centers in the ancient Mediterranean world, that would leave behind the remains of sanctuaries and treasury buildings and colonnaded walkways that still stand in their ruined form on the same pale limestone shore where the story begins. But the goddess was not thinking about any of that in the moment after Zeus granted what she asked. She was not thinking about the centuries of religious observation that would be built around her birth or around her brothers. She was already in her attention and her purpose somewhere in the mountains. The 30 cities were hers. The harbors and the roads were hers. The hunting bow she would get from the Cyclopes when the time came. She had not gone to them yet. The silver had not yet been worked, but the asking was done and the grant was complete. And somewhere in the high places above the forested slopes and the rocky passes, something that had been waiting for her was waiting still, already hers, already holding the shape of the life she had just claimed. The island of Delos sat in its stillness in the wide Aegean. The last afternoon light was leaving the limestone ridgeline. The water around the shore was going from blue to the dark blue that Aegean water goes in the last light, slow and even, the color deepening without drama. The wind continued over the bare stone. Somewhere above the human world, in the mountains that were now hers to inhabit, a goddess was already thinking about heights she had not yet stood on, about the cold air of the upper slopes before sunrise, about the paths that the animals made through the high forested places, and the particular quality of stillness that those places held between one movement and the next. She had asked, and she had been heard, and she had been given. The negotiation was over, the life was beginning, and her mind was already in the mountains before the words had entirely settled, before the 30 cities had finished being granted, before Zeus had completed the generosity of his giving, already oriented toward the wild high ground that was now and would always be the place she most completely was. On the island of Lipara, before the young goddess arrived, the Cyclopes were already at work. The forge had been burning since well before dawn, its heat pushing outward through the narrow entrance of the workshop and across the black rock of the island's shore, where the Tyrrhenian sea moved against the stone in long, unhurried repetitions. Inside, the sound of hammers carried through the air the way sound does in an enclosed and reverberant space, not loud so much as total, filling every part of the room and bouncing back changed. The Cyclopes worked by the light of the fire they had made. They did not need the sun. The thing being worked that morning was a trough for Poseidon, a vessel large enough to serve a god who spent his days in the open ocean and required implements sized to that occupation, and the hammers came down on it with the particular patience of craftsmen who understand that the object will take as long as the object takes, and that there is no use in hurrying bronze. This is where the account in Callimachus begins, not with the goddess approaching, not with her request, but with the work already underway. The trough, the hammers, the fire that never goes out. It is an odd starting point, and it is exactly right. The world the young Artemis was moving through was already full of labor, already involved in its own purposes, and she arrived into it the way a definite thing arrives, without announcement, taking up the space her arrival required. Callimachus wrote his hymn to Artemis sometime in the 3rd century before the Common Era, working in Alexandria, drawing on older material he knew well, and arranging it with the precision of a man who was also the head librarian of one of the largest collections of written material in the ancient world. What he produced in the Artemis hymn is not a hymn in the modern sense, not a song of praise moving toward a single culminating declaration. It is something more like a portrait, assembled from specific details, each one chosen for its clarity and its particularity, each one placing the goddess in a specific location, doing a specific thing. The result is a goddess who feels genuinely inhabited, not an abstraction clothed in divine attributes, a figure with preferences. Her preference on that morning on Lipara was for her bow. The Cyclopes turned from their work when she entered, which is its own kind of testament to how a presence registers in a closed space. They had been at the trough. They were not at the trough anymore. In the account, Artemis is very young, still carrying the quality of a child in the way she is described, bold with the particular boldness that comes from not yet having learned that boldness should be modulated. And she looked at the largest of the Cyclopes, and she asked him to make her what she needed before anything else was finished. Not after the trough, before. The trough for Poseidon could wait. There is something worth sitting with in that detail. The commission she was interrupting was for the god of the sea, one of the oldest and most considerable powers in the Greek cosmology. She was a child goddess on the first or second day of her existence, and she walked into their forge and redirected their labor as though the reordering of the Cyclops' priorities was simply a reasonable thing to ask for, because she needed her bow, and she needed it now. The Cyclopes in the account agreed. This is perhaps not surprising. What is interesting is the quality of agreement, not reluctant, not performed under protest, but straightforward. They turned from what they were doing, and they began what she needed. The silver bow they made her was not a hunting implement in any narrow functional sense. It was the instrument through which her particular relationship to the world was expressed, the thing that made her Artemis, and not simply a young woman in the hills with a preference for outdoor life. The bow in this tradition is a maker of distance. It works from far away. It resolves the space between the archer and the target without closing it, keeping the archer in a position of withdrawal even at the moment of greatest action. For a goddess who would spend her existence maintaining boundaries between her body and the world, between her domain and the human settlements below it, between the wilderness and the places where people built their houses, the bow is exactly the right instrument. It is a weapon that does not require contact. It accomplishes what it accomplishes, and then holds its position in the hand of the one who holds it. The arrows she requested alongside it were silver as well, or silver-tipped, depending on the source, and the quiver that held them was her constant companion in every account of her that survives. Across a very wide range of ancient imagery, vase paintings, sculpture, dedicatory reliefs, coin types, the quiver at the shoulder is among the first identifying marks of the goddess, along with the short tunic and the hound running at her side. She is almost never depicted without it. Even in images where the bow itself is not present, the quiver tells the viewer who this is. What she might do, given a moment and a reason, remains always possible. The instrument is always there. The forge on Lipara falls silent at some point in the telling. The work is done. The goddess takes what she came for. Outside, the sea is still the sea, moving against the rock, making the sound it has always made. From the forge, the account by Callimachus follows her into the company she would travel with for the rest of her mythological existence. And this company is worth understanding in some detail, because it tells a specific story about how this goddess was understood to move through the world, and what kind of world she was understood to move through. Thucydides, Nymphs who served as her hunting companions numbered 60 according to Callimachus, and they came from the ancient company of daughters attributed to the Titans Oceanus and Tethys, figures whose names survive in the oldest layers of Greek mythological material. 60 is a number that carries a particular quality in this context, large enough to constitute a world of its own, small enough to be a community rather than a crowd. They were not a following in the sense of an entourage attending a figure of importance. They were companions who shared the same practice, the same hills, the same hours before dawn, the same silence at the edge of a clearing when something moves in the undergrowth ahead. The word companion carries something different from the word servant, and the distinction matters in how the tradition understood the relationship between the goddess and the women around her. All of them had taken the same vow that she had taken. This is also a detail worth holding. Well in the account, the nymphs of her retinue were not simply present with her. They had made a specific commitment that mirrored her own, binding themselves to the same conditions of life that the goddess had requested from Zeus. What this created was not a court. It was something more like a society organized around a shared refusal, a collective definition of self that proceeded not by what was accepted, but by what was declined. They moved through the Greek mythological landscape as a group of women who had, collectively and individually, said no to one very large category of experience, and who had done this not under compulsion, but as an affirmative act, in service of something they understood to be worthwhile. The 20 Amnesian nymphs who served as her handmaidens occupied a slightly different role in the retinue. They came from the region of the Amnisos River in Crete, a real river flowing toward the northern coast of the island, known in antiquity as the site of a harbor used by Minos, and associated in the mythological tradition with various figures connected to the Minoan and Cretan strands of the Greek religious world. That these nymphs are identified by their river of origin, rather than by any genealogical lineage, grounds them in a particular landscape in a way that the Oceanids are not grounded. They carry their place with them in their name. The Amnesian nymphs are not simply nymphs. They are nymphs of a specific water in a specific part of the world, and they have been borrowed from that water to attend a goddess who will spend most of her time far from any coast. It is an interesting displacement. They carry Crete with them into the mountains of the mainland. They carry the river into the dry limestone uplands where the hunting happens. There is something in this arrangement that suggests the world of the goddess's retinue was a kind of assembled geography, portions of different landscapes gathered into a single moving company, the way a long life gathers the places it has passed through and holds them all at once. Among those who contributed to this company, before the retinue was fully assembled, was Pan. Pan appears in the Greek mythological tradition as the god of Arcadian forests and the uncultivated upland spaces between the settled valleys, a figure with goat legs and a goat's rough horns, associated with the panic that seizes travelers alone in wild places at noon, with the music of the syrinx made from river reeds, and with the specific quality of divine energy that exists in a landscape when no human being is managing it. He is not an Olympian in the formal sense. He inhabits a different order of the world, wilder, less architectural, more directly continuous with the landscape itself. His presence in the myth of Artemis's outfitting is in that sense entirely appropriate. He is already exactly where she is going. What Pan gave the goddess in the account preserved by Callimachus was dogs. The gift of dogs from Pan to Artemis is among the more specific details in the hymn, specific not just in number, but in character. The dogs he gave were not a generalized pack of hunting hounds. Each group in the account has a distinct capacity, Among the dogs were two spotted hounds described as powerful enough to pull down lions, a claim that places them in a category of animal magnitude that goes well beyond ordinary hunting. There was a broader pack capable of tracking and bringing down the generality of quarry that a hunting goddess might reasonably pursue through the course of a divine working life. And then there was a single dog of such particular strength and speed that it was said to be capable of felling a stag without running it down, without the chase, without the long pursuit through the trees, without the gradual narrowing of distance that constitutes the whole action of the hunt in most of its depictions. That last dog is worth a moment. The hunt, in ancient Greek understanding, was not merely a method of obtaining animals. It was a structured activity with its own ethics, its own sequence, its own relationship between pursuer and pursued. The chase was the heart of it. The bringing to bay, the final moment of contact between hound and stag at the end of a long run, these were the acts through which the hunt realized its nature. A dog that could fell a stag without running it down was a dog that collapsed the whole action into its conclusion, that moved directly from the beginning to the end, without the middle, that justified both. It was, in other words, a kind of absolute instrument, something beyond even the exceptional. The hounds moved alongside the goddess's retinue through every landscape the mythological accounts place them in. They are part of the world she inhabits as much as the bow is, or the short tunic, or the silver light of the moon. In the visual tradition, they appear at her heel, their heads below her knee, their noses toward the ground, their whole attention organized around the matter of tracking. They are working animals in the best sense, animals who have been made for a particular kind of engagement with the world, and who find in that engagement their complete expression. In the company of Artemis, they are always in the right place, doing the thing their nature equips them to do. From the company of dogs, the tradition moves, in Callimachus, to the deer, near the Cyrenian mountains, a range that appears in the ancient geographical tradition without the kind of precise modern identification that would pin it firmly to a single set of coordinates, which gives it a quality of being located somewhere real and specific while remaining slightly out of reach. The young goddess went in search of animals for her chariot. What she found there, or what she caught there, were golden-horned deer. The deer in this account are not ordinary animals who happen to have been selected for a divine harness. They are already marked as special. Their horns are gold. In a tradition that made extensive use of gold as a marker of the divine or the sacred, in which the adjective golden attached to an ordinary noun is almost always a signal that the noun has moved into a different category of significance. Golden horned deer are animals that exist at the boundary between the wild and the consecrated. They are wild animals who are already, in some sense, divine objects. Catching them was not simply a matter of hunting, it was a claiming of one sacred thing by another. The account says she caught 4 of them, 4 deer, standing together at the shoreline near the Cyrenian mountains, their breath rising in the same cold air, their golden horns held with the particular stillness that large animals achieve when they are not alarmed but are simply being, in the uncomplicated way that animals are, when nothing is requiring anything from them. She caught these 4 and brought them to her chariot, and they stood harnessed side by side with a quality of patience that belongs to animals that have not been broken into their situation but have simply arrived in it, animals who are, in some sense, at home in the harness, the way the hunting hounds are at home on the trail. But there was a 5th deer. The 5th golden-horned deer, in the account Callimachus gives, escaped. While she was securing the 4 she had taken, the 5th moved away, not in panic, not pursued, but simply gone, in the quiet, decisive way that animals disappear from a landscape when they have decided to be somewhere else. It crossed the river Celadon and went into the hills of Arcadia, and by crossing that river and entering that landscape, it became something else in the mythological tradition. It became the Cyrenian hind, the animal that Heracles would spend a year pursuing as the third of his labors, the creature he was told to bring back alive and unharmed to Eurystheus at Mycenae. What is interesting in the structure of this moment is that the escape is not presented as a failure. Artemis is not described as pursuing the fifth deer or as being frustrated by its departure. She had four. Four was enough to harness her chariot. The fifth moved into the hills of Arcadia, and the hills of Arcadia absorbed it, and the story of the fifth deer became a different story than the story of the four who stayed. The mythology simply accommodates both possibilities without adjudicating between them. 4 deer remain in the chariot. 1 deer goes into the hills. Both are true. Both are complete. The 5th deer crossed the river Celadon. On the other side, it entered a landscape that the Greek mythological tradition regarded as the interior of something, the mountainous heart of the Peloponnese, a region understood to be older than the cultures that surrounded it, wilder than the plains and the coasts, operating by slightly different rules than the rest of the world. The Cyrenian hind in Arcadia is an animal out of reach by definition. It is an animal that belongs to Artemis, which means that catching it requires her permission, which means that Heracles spent a year in pursuit of something that was already claimed and whose claimant had the final word on whether the pursuit could succeed. Euripides and Pindar both touch on the labor. The sources are not in complete agreement on how it resolved or what permission was given or withheld, but the hind survived. It always comes back to that. The hind survived. Somewhere in the hills of Arcadia, the 5th deer is still moving. The stream it crossed is still running, cold and clear over flat stones, moving between the hills in the direction it has always moved. The account does not follow the deer past the river. The account stops at the bank and watches it go. Alongside the bow and the dogs and the deer, the tradition places one more element in the natural world of the goddess, less active than the others, less obviously a working part of her mythology, but persistent across a long span of time and across a wide range of ancient sources: the cypress tree. The cypress in Greek religious life was a marker of specific kinds of space. It grew in sanctuaries. It grew at the edges of sacred enclosures. It grew in places where the ordinary distinctions of daily life, the boundary between the sacred and the profane, between the human and the divine, between the mortal and whatever exists on the other side of mortality, were understood to be thinner than usual, or more deliberate, or more requiring of acknowledgement. The cypress is a narrow tree. Its shape is almost exactly vertical. Where an oak or a plane tree spreads outward and claims horizontal space, the cypress moves straight up, drawing a line against the sky that the eye follows without effort. It is a tree that does not sprawl. It does not accommodate. It simply rises. In the cult of Artemis, the cypress appears at sanctuaries. It appears in the descriptions of sacred groves associated with the goddess in ancient sources, standing at the boundaries of the Temenos, the land formerly separated from common use and given to the goddess, where its vertical shape served something like the function of a marker. Here the ordinary world ends. Here something else begins. The cypress does not make this declaration loudly. It is simply there, its dark, narrow form against whatever color the sky happens to be that day, its shadow falling across the threshold of the sacred enclosure, with an accuracy that suggests deliberateness, though it is only a tree growing in the direction of its nature. The association between cypress trees and spaces of liminality, of transition, of the boundary between states, runs through the ancient world in ways that are not specific to the cult of Artemis, but that gather particular meaning in her sanctuaries. Artemis was, among everything else she was, a goddess of thresholds. She governed the passage of girls from one state of life to another. She held authority over the moment of birth, and in some versions of her mythology, over the moment of death. She moved between the city and the wilderness, between the human and the animal, between the night sky and the ground. A tree that marks the edge of things was an appropriate presence in a landscape that she owned. At Brar on the eastern coast of Attica, the landscape of the sanctuary includes the low rocky hills and the stream that runs near the site, and the trees that grew in ancient times along the margins of such places. At Ephesus, the great sanctuary on the western coast of Asia Minor was surrounded by woodland. At sites across the Greek world where Artemis was worshipped, the natural world was present, not as backdrop, but as material, as part of what the sanctuary consisted of, part of what made it what it was. The cypress stands at the edge of these sanctuaries in the literary and material record, the way it stands in any landscape, without urgency, without announcing itself, simply holding its position at the boundary of the space where the goddess receives what is brought to her. Its shadow is precise. Its roots hold in whatever ground it was planted in. It has been growing in that direction for a very long time. The retinue moves through all of this. 60 Oceanid companions and 20 Amnesian handmaidens, the hounds at their heels, the chariot behind, with its 4 golden-horned deer standing in their harness, the silver bow at the shoulder of the goddess, the quiver always present. This is not a figure who travels lightly, but the weight of the retinue is not the weight of an army or a court. It is the weight of a fully realized community of practice, a group of beings organized around a particular way of engaging with the world. The hills they moved through were real hills, understood by the people who worshipped Artemis to be actual landscape under her actual governance. Mount Taygetos in Laconia, the mountains of Arcadia, the forested ranges of Attica and Boeotia. The specific places named in the mythology were, for the people who told these stories, places they could travel to and find, places where the nature of the land itself made the goddess's presence feel credible in the way that a landscape can make a myth feel credible. This is exactly the kind of place where that would happen. The cold of the high slopes in early morning, the smell of pine resin in still air, the sound of water moving over stone in a narrow valley below the tree line. These are the conditions in which the retinue exists. These are the conditions in which the silver bow is carried, and the hounds work the ground ahead. The nymphs of the retinue do not speak much in the surviving accounts. They are described rather than quoted, but their presence in the mythology is consistent across sources, and the consistency suggests something about what the ancient tradition understood the goddess's existence to require. She does not travel alone. Whatever the vow of independence that defines her, the eternal virginity, the freedom from the obligations of marriage and household, the liberty of the wilderness over the authority of the city, her independence is exercised inside a community. She is alone in the sense that she answers to no man and to no God in the arrangement of her daily life. She is not alone in the sense of being solitary. The 60 companions move with her. They see what she sees. They hunt the same ground. This is a distinction that the ancient sources do not belabor, but do consistently maintain. The retinue is always there. The nymphs are always present. And when one of them breaks the vow that holds them together, when one of them fails to maintain the commitment they all made, the consequence for the group is felt precisely because the vow was a collective one, and the breaking of it is therefore a kind of loss of something shared. The community is not backdrop, it is structure. It is the thing inside which the goddess's particular mode of being in the world is legible. The hounds move at their heels through all of this. Their breath is visible in the cold mountain air. Their noses are always working. They read the landscape through a sense the women walking above them cannot access a continuous text written in the ground and the air and the bark of trees, available only to them, constantly updated with the presence and motion of everything that has passed through this terrain in the last hours. They are in some sense the most perfectly specialized members of the retinue. Everything they are has been organized around a single form of attention, and that form of attention is given entirely to the landscape that contains them. A spotted hound moving at heel through low scrub carries the whole structure of the hunt in its body, not its outcome. The hunt is not always successful, and the hound does not need it to be. What it carries is the practice, the nose to the ground, the head lifting when the scent column clarifies, the slight change in the carriage of the shoulders when something ahead has become more definite than it was. This is the activity that the hound was made for, and the activity is present in the body regardless of what the morning yields. The mountain produces or it does not. The hound attends to it either way. Before the sun has fully cleared the eastern ridge on any given morning in this landscape, the retinue is already moving. This is the hour that appears most frequently in the ancient descriptions of the hunt, the hour before full light, when the temperature is still low, when the air holds scent well, when the animals that were moving through the night have not yet settled into the stillness of the midday hours. The 80 women distributed across a forested hillside in this hour produce very little sound. Their footsteps on leaf-covered ground are quiet. Their voices, when they speak at all, are low. The sound of them is not easily distinguishable from the sound of the wind in the high branches, or from the sound of the stream in the valley below, or from the various small motions that a forest makes on its own in the time before dawn has fully organized the day. In this hour, the cypress trees at the edge of the clearing, where the forest opens toward the sky, are dark against a pale ground. Their narrow shapes are the first things resolved by the eye, when the light is still insufficient to define the more complex forms around them. They stand at the margin of the open space, the way they always stand, vertical, precise, their roots in the same ground they have always occupied. The threshold they mark is the same threshold it has always been. Whatever is on the other side of it continues to be on the other side of it. The boundary has not moved. The deer, somewhere ahead in the pale light, are doing what deer do in the hour before dawn, feeding or moving between feeding grounds, or standing with their heads up and their ears rotating, attending to sounds the retinue has not yet made, or has made too quietly to register at that distance. Their hooves place themselves carefully on the stony ground. Their breath rises and disappears. They are not yet alarmed. The morning has not yet required anything from them that they have not been prepared by their nature to provide. The chariot with its 4 golden-horned deer stands somewhere in this landscape as well, though Callimachus does not often bring the chariot into the descriptions of the hunt itself. The chariot belongs to the journey between places, to the passages from one mountain to another, to the descents from the high forested ranges into the valleys where the sanctuaries stand and the offerings are received. In the hours of actual hunting, the goddess moves on foot, with the retinue, through terrain that does not accommodate wheels. The chariot waits. The deer stand harnessed in their patient, unhurried stillness, their golden horns catching whatever light reaches them through the trees, their feet placed with the precision of animals who are never entirely at rest, even when they are standing still. And somewhere across the river Celadon, in the hills of Arcadia, the fifth deer moves through a landscape that continues past the edge of this account. Its golden horns are not visible from the riverbank. It has passed the crossing already, into the interior, into the old forested hills where the boundary between what is human and what is animal was always understood to be a matter of particular delicacy. It moves the way the tradition says it moves, unhurried, alone, carrying in its body the fact of its escape, the fact of its difference from the four who stayed, going somewhere. Not yet arrived. The river behind it, running cold and clear over flat stones, moving in the direction it has always moved, carrying nothing from the crossing forward except the sound of itself, which it has been making since long before the story began, and which it continues to make long after the story leaves the bank and turns away from the water and lets the fifth deer go. An ordinary Athenian family preparing a daughter for marriage would have understood, without needing it explained, that the goddess who governed this passage would never make it herself. Artemis held authority over the transition from girlhood into adulthood, over the bleeding and the growing and the slow closing of childhood, and yet the goddess herself stood permanently outside all of that, unchanged by anything time did to a woman's body, a permanent virgin in a tradition that understood marriage and motherhood as the shape a woman's life was supposed to take. The paradox was not hidden or softened, it was simply part of what Artemis was. A small girl carrying a votive offering toward a sanctuary on the eastern coast of Attica was walking toward a deity who had refused, from the first moments of her divine existence, everything the girl was being prepared to enter. This was not understood as contradiction. The Greeks held it as something more interesting than contradiction, as the particular authority that comes from standing permanently outside a thing while governing it completely. Artemis knew the transition from childhood to womanhood, the way a keeper of thresholds knows the door, not by passing through it, but by standing at it indefinitely, watching everything cross. The goddess who brought girls safely to the edge of adulthood and handed them over to it was the one being in the tradition for whom that edge had never arrived. Whatever she gave to the girls who came to her, and the tradition held that she gave them much, she gave it entirely from the outside. The sanctuary at Brairon sits on the eastern coast of Attica, on a low rocky shelf above the sea, close enough to the water that on certain days the sound of it reaches even the interior of the sanctuary grounds. The Oresino stream runs nearby. The coastline there is spare and pale, the kind of Attic landscape that offers little softness, limestone and salt, wind and the low scrub that manages between the rocks, and the sanctuary sits in it with the practical plainness that characterized many of Artemis's cult sites, which were not always grand or columned, but were always specific, always placed with attention to a particular piece of ground and the particular quality of wildness it carried. To reach Brairon from Athens, a family would have traveled east across the peninsula, away from the city, toward the coast. The journey itself was part of the meaning. The ritual practiced at Brairon was called the Arctea. The word comes from Arctos, the Greek word for bear, and the girls who came to serve the goddess at this sanctuary were known, during their time there, as Arctoi, bears. They were not women. They were not quite children. They were girls between approximately 5 and 10 years of age, sent by their families to live at the sanctuary for a period, to serve Artemis in whatever way the ritual required, and to return to ordinary Athenian life, afterward changed by the experience, in ways that would prepare them for marriage. Exactly what happened at Breron during the Arctea is not fully known. What survives in the literary sources, in the objects recovered from the ground of the sanctuary itself, suggest processions, foot races, ritual activity, whose precise form has not been entirely recovered. But the girls ran. The Kraterskoi, the small painted vessels recovered in numbers from the sanctuary, show them running, arms out, legs open in full stride, their painted bodies moving through the space of the pot's decoration as though they could continue past its edge. There is something worth sitting with in that image. Small terracotta vessels, palm-sized, made to hold offerings, their surfaces painted with girls in motion. Some of the figures on these vessels are shown running in what look like ritual processions. Some appear to be playing. Some are shown with bears, the animal that gave the ritual its name, standing at a distance or moving alongside the human figures with the calm particularity of an animal that is present in the story, without being threatening to it. These objects were left at the sanctuary as dedications, placed there by the girls themselves or by their families, and recovered more than 2 millennia later from the earth of the site, which had preserved them against the passage of everything that had passed over them. They are now in the museum at Breron. The girls on them are still running in the same direction they always ran, their painted arms still out, their painted feet never reaching the ground. Among those recovered objects are also marble statues of children, small figures, some of them fragmentary. The surviving pieces worn by soil and groundwater into the particular smoothness that centuries of burial produce. A child's hand, broken at the wrist, fingers slightly curved, the surface of it almost polished by time, the detail of its knuckles still faintly visible beneath the erosion. These objects were real children once, or representations of real children, placed at the sanctuary by families with daughters. They were entrusting to a ritual whose outlines we can still see, and whose interior we cannot fully enter. What the girls experienced at Breron, what it felt like to live at the edge of the sea for a season, far from the city, bearing the name of an animal, running in processions for a goddess who was watching from somewhere, the ritual kept open between the human world and her world. This, the objects can only point toward. The thing itself does not survive, except in the motion still held by the painted figures on the Krateriskoi, and in the question the marble hand raises with its broken wrist and its slightly curving fingers. The myth that sat behind the Arctea, the story that the ritual was understood to be responding to, involves a bear. One account holds that a bear sacred to Artemis was killed near the sanctuary, either accidentally or through an act of rashness, and that the goddess required a period of service from the daughters of Athens in compensation or in acknowledgement or in careful ritual repair of what had been broken between the human community and the divine one. Another version involves a girl who was herself injured by the bear, the story shifting from the death of the sacred animal to an injury to a sacred girl, the two somehow equivalent within the logic of the myth. Exactly which version was operative at Breron, which story the ritual was understood to be fulfilling, is not entirely clear from the sources that survive. What is clear is that the girls who served as arctoi were participating in something the tradition understood as necessary, as owed, as the kind of careful maintenance that kept the relationship between humans and the goddess intact. The bear is worth pausing on. Artemis was not typically bear-figured in the mainstream of Greek tradition. She was more often associated with deer and with hounds, with the animals of the hunt, rather than the large border-crossing animals of the deep forest. But the bear keeps appearing at the edges of her mythology, in ways that suggest the association was older than the more polished literary tradition preserves. At Breron, the girls became bears. In the myth of Callisto, one of Artemis's nymphs, an Arcadian companion bound by the same vow of chastity as the goddess, transformation into a bear is the punishment for the breaking of that vow. The bear shape in the stories around Artemis seems to carry something about the threshold between the wild and the human, the animal and the formed, the child and the woman. The girls at Brauron, in taking on the bear's name, were not pretending to be dangerous. They were, for a season, something not quite settled, not fully within the human world, not fully within the wild one, living in the space between under the governance of a goddess who occupied that space permanently. The practice of dedicating childhood objects to Artemis before marriage was distinct from the Arctia, but operated within the same understanding of the goddess's authority. Across many Greek regions and across several centuries, the pattern appears in the sources with enough consistency to be understood as widespread practice rather than local peculiarity. A young woman on the eve of her wedding would bring to a sanctuary of Artemis the objects that had belonged to her girlhood: toys, small dolls, the shorter garments she had worn as a child, sometimes a lock of her hair, and dedicate them to the goddess. The dedications were a formal acknowledgement that something was ending. The girl was crossing a threshold, and Artemis governed that threshold, and the act of leaving the objects of childhood at the goddess's sanctuary was the act of asking permission, or giving notice, or paying a kind of careful respect to the one who presided over the crossing. The lock of hair carries a particular weight in this. Hair, in the ancient Greek understanding, was connected to vitality and identity in ways that made cutting it a meaningful act rather than an incidental one. To cut a lock of hair and leave it at a sanctuary was to leave something of oneself behind, not symbolically, or not only symbolically, but in a sense that the tradition took seriously, as an actual piece of the person who had been a girl, deposited with the goddess of the threshold as the girl herself moved forward through it. The garments of girlhood left at the altar were the same, the doll placed at the base of the stone. These were not performances of sentiment. They were the careful, practical management of a transition that the tradition understood to be genuinely hazardous, not because Artemis was threatening, but because crossings were dangerous in themselves. And this crossing in particular required the attention of the goddess, who understood it better than anyone. A young woman at the altar of Artemis on the eve of her wedding, setting the doll down carefully at the stone's base, stepping back with her hands at her sides, she was doing something that young women had done before her and would do after her in sanctuaries across the Greek world, and for as long as the practice held. The moment itself was quiet and private in its emotional content, even when it was performed in a ritual context, because what was being given up was specific and individual, even when the form of giving it up was shared. The girl on the vase from that sanctuary, her arms still out, still running, she was one stage behind this moment. The woman at the altar was one stage ahead of it, already facing toward the world she was about to enter, already standing with the door open. The goddess who received these dedications was herself the most famous permanent instance of refusing to enter that door. Artemis asked her father for eternal virginity before she asked for her bow, or her mountains, or her nymphs, which in the tradition established by Calamitus makes the refusal of womanhood the first and most fundamental of her self-definitions. Not the hunt, not the wilderness, the permanent uncrossing of the threshold was the foundation on which everything else was built, and it is this that makes the role of Artemis in the lives of Greek girls something stranger and more interesting than simple patronage. She was not simply the goddess one prayed to for a safe birth or a successful marriage, though she was that too, in certain of her functions. She was the one who governed the transition precisely because she had defined herself against it. The one who stood at the door and never went through was the one who knew the door best. The myth of Iphigenia sits at the edge of all of this, larger and more complicated than the Arctia or the dedications, and it does not resolve cleanly. In the version that the Homeric tradition and the later tragic tradition worked with, Agamemnon, king of Argos and commander of the Greek forces gathering at Aulis to sail for Troy, offended Artemis. The exact nature of the offense varies in the telling. In some versions, he killed a deer sacred to the goddess. In some, he boasted carelessly about his own skill as a hunter in a way that amounted to a slight against the divine huntress. In some, the offense is older and more obscure, the kind of inherited debt that accumulates across generations of a house that has made too many wrong choices. Whatever its origin, the offense produced a consequence. The harbor at Aulis went still. The winds that should have carried the Greek fleet toward Troy failed entirely. The sails hung slack, the water showed no motion. The army sat in its camp and waited, and the stillness continued with the absolute indifference that the natural world achieves when it has been enlisted by a divine will. The seer Calchas read the situation and delivered the answer the Greeks did not want. Artemis required satisfaction. The satisfaction she required was the sacrifice of Iphigenia, Agamemnon's daughter. The harbor at Aulis, still and colorless under a sky without wind. This was the shape the goddess's displeasure took in the world. Not thunder, not flame, not the visible intervention of divine power in human affairs. Simply a stopping. The world declining to cooperate, the wind choosing not to blow, the sea choosing to be a mirror rather than a road. The fleet could not move. The war could not begin. Everything that had been set in motion stopped and waited for the girl. What happened at the altar of Artemis at Aulis? This is where the sources divide, and where the most significant version of the story opens into something that changes the meaning of everything that came before it. In the version that Euripides worked with in his play about Iphigenia's later life, the knife descended and the girl was not there. In the moment before the sacrifice was completed, Artemis intervened, quietly, without spectacle, and substituted a deer for the girl at the altar. Iphigenia was taken, in that same moment, to Taurus, a place on the far shore of the Black Sea, where she served as priestess of Artemis for years, her family not knowing she lived. The Greek fleet received its wind. The war proceeded, and Iphigenia stood in a sanctuary in a foreign country, tending the rites of the goddess who had taken her from the altar, performing the work of the priesthood with the steadiness of someone who has been claimed by a divine will and understood that this is what her life is now. This version matters because of what it does to the logic of divine power and divine attention. Artemis demanded the sacrifice. Artemis also prevented it. She required something extreme and then refused to let the extremity occur, substituting an animal for the girl and relocating the girl to a place where she could continue to serve the goddess in a living capacity rather than in the absolute and irreversible form of the dead. The tradition offers this without explaining it entirely, which is part of how the tradition works. The full logic of what Artemis was doing is not made transparent, because the full logic of what a goddess wants does not reduce to human explanation. What it preserved in the version Euripides shaped was an Iphigenia still alive on the far shore of the world, still in the goddess's service, the sacrifice transformed rather than completed. In the Euripidean version, Iphigenia's brother Orestes eventually found his way to Taurus, and she helped him escape with the ancient wooden image of the goddess that the sanctuary held. They brought the image back to Greece, to a new sanctuary where the cult of Artemis could continue in a different form. This is the tradition's way of saying that the goddess traveled, that her worship was not fixed to a single point, but moved through the Greek world, as the myths moved, taking root wherever the right conditions existed, wherever the ground and the water and the particular quality of a place corresponded to what Artemis required. The cult of Artemis at Braren was itself understood to be connected to Iphigenia. One tradition held that Iphigenia died at Braren and was buried there, the priestess of the goddess interred in the sanctuary where the Arctia was performed, her death and the ritual of the girls held together in the same sacred ground. Another tradition identified Braren as the place where Iphigenia and Orestes arrived after leaving Taurus, bringing the ancient image of the goddess with them, and that it was this image carried from a foreign sanctuary to the coast of Attica that established the cult at Braren in the first place. The goddess in this reading was brought back to Greece by the girl who had served her on the far shore of the world. The sacrifice transformed into a journey, the journey ending in a sanctuary where small girls would run in procession, bearing the bare name of the goddess's wild domain. The Braren that the excavations have uncovered is a place of considerable quietness. The sanctuary occupies a terrace of ground above the stream, the sea visible nearby, the landscape around it open enough that weather would always have been present, the sound of water, the salt in the wind, the low attic sky. What the ground gave back when it was dug was the ordinary material of long religious use, the kritariskoi, with their painted girls, the marble statues of children, the fragmentary evidence of the lives of the people who came here to participate in something they understood as necessary and binding. No great dramatic finds, no single object that explained the whole. Instead, the patient accumulation of small things, a pot, a hand, a fragment of painted procession, that together begin to suggest the shape of what the sanctuary held for the families who brought their daughters to it. The bears were not only metaphorical. Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, recorded the existence of actual bears kept at the sanctuary, animals held within the sacred precinct, real bears living in the vicinity of the cult site, their presence understood as continuous with the ritual identity of the girls who served there. Whether this practice went back to the earliest period of the Arctia or was a later elaboration is not established with certainty, but the image it produces is striking. Real bears and girl bears sharing the same bounded sacred ground, both living temporarily outside the ordinary categories of the human world under the governance of a goddess who herself occupied permanently the space beyond those categories. The wild and the girl, both suspended within the ritual for as long as the service lasted. The girls who served at Braren would have been between 5 and 10 years old, sent away from their families, living at the sanctuary under the supervision of its priests and priestesses, performing whatever the ritual required of them. What that felt like from the inside, whether it was frightening or exciting or simply the particular texture of a familiar practice, ordinary, because every girl in a certain social position went through it, is not something the sources give directly. What the sources give is the practice, the object, the outline. The interior of the experience belongs to the girls themselves, and the girls left the kratariskoi and the marble hands and the dedications of their childhoods, and those are what we have. A cloth doll set carefully at the base of a stone altar, fingers releasing it, a step back, the sound of the sanctuary around the girl, the stream, the wind off the sea, and then turning toward the door and the ordinary world beyond it, which is now the world she is entering for the first time as a woman. The doll stays. The girl goes through. Artemis, who has governed this threshold from the beginning of her divine existence, remains exactly where she has always been, standing at the boundary, neither inside the human world nor entirely outside it, watching the crossing from the permanent vantage point of someone who will never cross. There is a way in which the whole religious relationship between Artemis and the girls who came to her, the Arctia, the dedications, the prayers before and after childbirth that also fell within her domain, makes most sense, not as paradox, but as the particular kind of authority that comes from refusal. The goddess who would not become a woman was not absent from womanhood. She surrounded it. She governed its approach, attended its crises, received the objects of childhood that had to be surrendered before it could begin. What she did not do was enter it herself, and this permanent externality was not a limitation of her power in this domain, but its source. She could govern the threshold because she was never on either side of it, but always at it, always standing exactly at the point where girl became woman, and holding that point open with the patience of something divine and unchanging. The ancient writers who reflected on Artemis, Callimachus, who gave the fullest early account of her character and preferences, Euripides, who put Iphigenia on stage and gave the rescue version of her story, Pausanias, who traveled to the sanctuaries and wrote down what he saw and what the local traditions held. None of them seem to have found the paradox of the virgin goddess governing female transition disturbing or irresolvable. They moved around it with the ease of people who have always understood that the one who governs a thing need not participate in it. The keeper of the door is not the traveler. The goddess at the threshold is not the girl who crosses it. Both have their function. The function of the girl is to cross. The function of Artemis is to be at the crossing always, ensuring that it holds, that it remains a crossing and not a disaster, that the girl who goes through it comes out the other side intact. The sanctuary at Browrun continued to be used into the late classical period, and the evidence from the ground suggests that the practice of the Arctia was maintained across several centuries. This is the ordinary length of religious practice in the ancient world, not a single generation, not a single century, but the long, slow continuation of a form that worked, that satisfied something in the relationship between the human community and the divine world, that was renewed by each generation of girls who came to the sanctuary on the coast and ran in the procession and bore the name of the bear for the length of their service. The form persisted because it was doing something real. The girls who completed the Arctia returned to Athens prepared for marriage. The goddess who received them received also, from each one, the particular attention that the ritual required, the physical presence of the girl in the sanctuary, the running, the service, the time spent outside the ordinary structure of family life, in a space that belonged to Artemis rather than to the human community. The dedications that filled the sanctuary over those centuries accumulated like a slow tide, pot after pot, figure after figure, the small objects of girls' lives given over to the goddess of the threshold, with the steady regularity of a practice that each family understood to be necessary. Most of these objects were ordinary. Most of the girls who left them were ordinary. They were Athenian daughters of families with enough standing to participate in the Arctia, which was not open to every girl in Attica. And this detail matters, because it means the sanctuary was not simply the religious property of the goddess, but also of the particular community whose daughters came to it. The ritual bore the weight of both the divine relationship and the social one. Both were real. Both were present in the running figures on the pots, and and the pots remain. In their museum cases at Braron, the Kratishkoi stand in their rows, their painted surfaces still carrying the girls who ran on them, arms out, feet in mid-stride, moving in the same direction they have always moved, through the same procession they have always been part of. The figures were fired into terracotta before any of the girls who ran the actual procession were born. They outlasted every one of the girls who ran after them. They outlasted the sanctuary itself in its active form, the living practice of the Arctea, the Athenian state that organized it, most of the literary tradition that recorded it. They sit in their cases, and the painted girls on them are still running, still mid-stride, still in the ritual procession that is the only world the figures have ever inhabited, and they have been carrying that motion forward through time, through the centuries of soil above the sanctuary, through the excavation that uncovered them, through the handling and the cataloging in the museum case without interruption. The Arctea, as the girls experienced it, is not recoverable in its fullness. The Arctea, as the pots preserve it, has not stopped. Artemis received the girls who came to her and returned them to their world. She received the objects of their childhoods and held them in the sanctuary's ground. She was present at the beginning of the process and at the end of it, and entirely absent from the middle of it, from the marriage, the house, the children, the domestic interior that the Greek world understood as the proper form of a woman's life. She stood at the threshold, and she stood there permanently, and that permanence was what made the threshold safe to cross, not because she would prevent what was on the other side from being what it was, but because the crossing itself was under the governance of something steady and unchanging, something that had always been there and would always be there, something that did not itself cross, but that held the crossing open for everyone who came to it. The small vessels in their cases hold the girls still running. The light in the museum is steady and unhurried. The direction the painted figures are moving has not changed. The procession continues across the surface of the terracotta in the same direction it has always gone, and the goddess stands somewhere at the edge of it, at the boundary of the sanctuary, at the threshold between the girl's world and the woman's world, at the place where the wild and the human meet, and where nothing, under her governance, has ever fully resolved into one thing or the other. The Kratishkoi stand in their rows, and the girls on them are still running, and they have been running in that direction, through that painted morning, without stopping, for a very long time. The ridgeline of Mount Taygetos changes color 4 times before noon. From the valley floor below Sparta, in the gray light before full dawn, the limestone peaks hold a pale blue that is not quite the color of the sky above them, and not quite the color of the stone itself, but something between, as though the mountain is still deciding what it is. As the sun clears the eastern hills across the Eurotes Valley, the blue goes out of the rock and the ridgeline whitens, the highest outcroppings catching the light, while the forested slopes below remain in long shadow. By mid-morning, the whole range has gone to the color of dry bone, sharp and bright against whatever weather is moving in from the west. And then, in the hour before the sun moves behind the peaks, the stone darkens to something almost amber, and the shadows in the ravines below the ridge go so deep and still. They seem less like shadows than like permanent features of the mountain, things that were always there and will always be there, independent of whatever the sun chooses to do overhead. Taygetos is high. The range runs for approximately 60 kilometers north to south along the western edge of the Laconian plain, and its highest point rises to around 2,400 meters above the sea. From the valley, the upper slopes look from a distance like bare rock, but travelers who have gone up into the mountain describe something different when they arrive at the tree line and pass through it, a sudden density of pine and fir, the temperature dropping, the sound of the valley falling away behind them, as though the world below has simply become too far to carry sound from one place to the other. The ancient sources understood this quality of the high mountains specifically. The slopes above a certain altitude were genuinely wild in a way the cultivated plains below were not, and the wildness was not a failure of order, but an order of a different kind, one that preceded and exceeded anything human arrangement had achieved in the valley. Artemis held this mountain. That is how the ancient Greek religious understanding expressed it. Not that she was worshipped here, not that her temple stood here, but that the mountain itself was under her governance. As though the arrangement between the goddess and the high slopes was something older than the vocabulary of worship and required different language to describe. In the Laconian tradition, Taygetos was not simply a landscape feature with a cult association. It was territory. The forested upper zones above the inhabited land belonged to the goddess in a territorial sense that had theological weight behind it, and the people who lived in the valley below understood themselves to be living at the edge of a domain they had not built and did not govern. This is the frame within which the ancient Greek world understood the wilderness as a religious category. The wild was not empty. It was not ungoverned. It was governed by a different authority than the one that presided over cities and farmland and harbors, and the name of that authority, in the Greek understanding, was very often hers, on Mount Taygetos, and on dozens of other mountains and forested ranges throughout the Greek world. The high ground was Artemis's ground, and the quality of stillness that travelers have described on those upper slopes, the particular silence of a place where the sounds of human activity have faded entirely behind you, was understood by the people who climbed there, not as the absence of something, but as the presence of something very specific, something that had been there long before any of them arrived, and would remain there when they came back down. Below the high peaks, in the valley, the Eurotas River runs between the banks of reeds and tamarisk that ancient writers described in their accounts of this landscape. The river is not wide. In summer it narrows considerably, and in certain stretches you can see the riverbed through the water clearly enough to count the stones on it. But the Eurotas occupies a particular place in the Laconian landscape that has more to do with its position than its size. It is the organizing line of the valley, the thing the valley is arranged around, and everything in the plain refers to it in the way that settlements and farmland and roads always refer to the water source they depend on. Standing at the river's edge and looking west, the slopes of Taygetos rise immediately and steeply, the forested middle zones already dense and dark, even from the valley floor. The limestone ridgeline above them, pale and distant, and absolutely clear on a dry day. The ancient Greek religious imagination made extensive use of this geography. The contrast between the cultivated valley and the wild mountain was not merely a physical contrast, but a theological one, a visible boundary between the human order and the divine order that presided over what lay beyond human arrangement. And Artemis presided specifically over that second category, over the high ground, the forested margin, the spaces between settlements where the land was doing something other than what humans had asked of it. She was not a goddess of disorder. The ancient sources are consistent on this point. The wilderness she governed was not chaos, but a different kind of order, one with its own rules and its own hierarchy, one that the human world needed to acknowledge rather than ignore if it wanted to move safely through the spaces it could not control. The word temenos carries this distinction in its structure. It comes from the Greek verb temno, which means to cut And what the word describes is precisely a cutting, a formal separation of one piece of ground from the land around it and its dedication to a deity. The action of temno is what created sacred space in the ancient Greek religious understanding. Not building, not consecration by a priest performing a rite over ground that was otherwise ordinary. The cutting itself was the act, the drawing of a line that said, this ground is now of a different category than the ground beside it, and the rules that govern ordinary land do not apply here. What is particular about the Temenos in the cult of Artemis is how frequently the sacred enclosure was not a built structure at all. Other deities had temples at the center of their sacred precincts, roofed buildings with cult statues inside, spaces defined by architecture and the human work of construction. Artemis had these too, in many places, and her sanctuaries at Brairon and Ephesus were substantial built complexes by any measure. But a significant portion of her cult sites operated without a central structure, or with only the most minimal built element, an altar, perhaps a stele, perhaps a boundary marker at the edge of the enclosure, and the sacred space was the ground itself, an outdoor temenos, a piece of hillside or mountain slope or forest clearing that had been formally cut from the surrounding land and given to the goddess, and where the governance of the ordinary world was set aside in deference to hers. The boundary marker of such a place was typically a stone, flat or approximately flat, set into the ground at the edge of the sacred enclosure, sometimes inscribed and sometimes not. The inscription, when it existed, stated what the stone was. This is the temenos boundary. This is the limit of the sacred ground. But the stone did not need the inscription to function. The marking itself was sufficient. What mattered was the physical presence of the boundary in the landscape, the fact that someone had placed an object in the ground that said, on this side, the ordinary world, on that side, something else entirely. The temenos stones that marked Artemis's outdoor sanctuaries have not all survived. Many were lost under centuries of soil and vegetation, or were moved by farmers clearing ground, or were taken and used as building material in later periods when the religious life they marked had ended or transformed. But some have been found, and some are still in the positions they were placed in, and the experience of encountering one in the landscape, half buried in a hillside, the grass growing up to its edge, the line it once marked still legible in the ground, if the light is right, is a particular kind of encounter with something very old that has kept its position through every season that has passed over it. In Arcadia, the mountainous interior of the Peloponnese, the landscape in which these boundary stones were placed was already a landscape that the Greek imagination understood as singular. Arcadia was not like the rest of the Peloponnese. Its geography worked against the kinds of arrangement, coastal cities, river valley settlements, agricultural plains organized around a central urban nucleus that characterized the Greek world elsewhere. The mountain ranges of Arcadia's interior created a terrain of isolated valleys, narrow passes, dense upland forests, and high rocky plateaus that resisted the ordinary forms of Greek civic organization. The communities that lived there were smaller and more dispersed, and the landscape between them was wilder and less traversed than the landscapes between settlements in most of the rest of Greece. The Greek literary tradition understood this as something more than geography. Arcadia, in the mythological imagination, was the place where the boundary between the human world and the animal world was thinnest. Not because Arcadians were thought to be less civilized than other Greeks. The Arcadians had their own proud traditions and their own complex religious life, but because the landscape itself, in its resistance to cultivation and civic order, seemed to the Greek imagination to preserve something that the rest of the world had covered over, something older, something that the gods of the wilderness had not fully withdrawn from. And in that older, wilder, thinner boundaried space, Artemis was among the most present of all divine figures. The hunting myths set in Arcadia carry this quality. The golden horned deer that Artemis pursued along the slopes of the Ceryneian mountains moved through a landscape that the tradition understood as genuinely hers, not because she had claimed it recently, but because it had always been that kind of landscape, the kind where a goddess of the wild could pursue something extraordinary across terrain that the human world had not yet organized into something tame, the deer that escaped, crossing the river Celadon into the Arcadian hills and disappearing into the forested interior, vanished into a landscape that was understood as capable of holding such a creature, vast enough and wild enough to conceal something divine among its trees and ridges indefinitely, until the moment a story required it to reappear. Pan was at home in this landscape too, the goat-legged god of Arcadian forests, whose name ancient writers sometimes connected to the word for all, though this etymology is disputed, was a deity of a different register than Artemis, older in certain ways, and stranger, a god of panic and piping and the sudden unreasonable fear that can descend in wilderness spaces in the midday heat. But Pan and Artemis shared the Arcadian landscape in the tradition, and the gifts of hunting dogs that Pan presented to the young goddess in the Callimachus account were gifts that carried the Arcadian forest with them, animals bred in and for that specific kind of terrain, capable of navigating the density and the incline and the particular challenges of mountain hunting in the Greek interior. To move through Arcadia on foot, through its narrow valleys and over its forested ridges, is to understand something about why the Greek religious imagination placed its wildest and most demanding mythological territory here. The scale of the mountains is not alpine. These are not the kinds of peaks that inspire awe through sheer height. The scale is intimate. The ridge lines press close. The valleys are narrow enough that the forest on both sides feels present and immediate rather than distant, and the sound of a stream in the valley bottom carries up the slopes with surprising clarity. It is a landscape that does not hold you at arm's length and let you observe it. It pulls you into its own logic and asks you to navigate by different means than the ones that work in open country. This is the quality that the Greek concept of agrios, wild belonging to the wild, was trying to name. Agrios was not a simple description of terrain, it was a theological category. To say that a mountain or a forest or a river source was agrios was to say that it was genuinely inhabited by divine presences that had not withdrawn from it, and that human movement through such places required acknowledgement of the authority that governed them. The wild was not empty space waiting to be made useful. It was full of the kinds of life and presence that human activity tended to drive away, and it was operating according to its own arrangements that predated the human world and would outlast it if left to their own processes. The ancient Greeks encoded this understanding in the specific places they chose not to disturb. A tree that stood within a temenos boundary was not to be cut. A spring that rose within a sacred enclosure was not to be diverted or stopped. A grove that had been associated with a deity since before the oldest memory of the local community was to be left standing, even when the timber would have been useful, even when the ground beneath it would have made productive farmland. The restraint was not sentimental, it was theological. The grove, or the spring, or the tree was agrios in the religious sense, operating under a different authority, and to cut it or divert it or remove it without the proper ritual acknowledgement was to commit an act with consequences that the tradition took seriously. At Lake Numi, in the Alban Hills south of Rome, the Roman cult of Diana, who was understood as the equivalent of Artemis in the Roman religious tradition, though Diana carried her own distinct character and her own particular Roman context, maintained one of the most unusual priesthoods in the ancient world. The lake sits inside a volcanic crater, its water dark and still. The forested slopes of the crater rise around it on all sides, and the grove that stood at the water's edge in antiquity was called the Nemus Aricinum, the grove of Aricia, from which the goddess's cult title, Diana Nemorensis, Diana of the Grove, derived. The stillness of the water inside the crater, the density of the surrounding forest, the particular quality of enclosure that a volcanic lake produces, all of this created a setting that was agrios in the fullest sense, a place that felt genuinely separated from the ordinary world by its own geography. The priesthood of this sanctuary operated by a rule that scholars have found difficult to parallel elsewhere in the ancient world. The priest held the title Rex Nemorensis, the King of the Wood, and his tenure in that office was secured by the single act of having killed his predecessor. He had obtained the role through violence, and he would lose it through violence, and in between he lived in the grove, armed, in a state of permanent vigilance against the challenger who would eventually come to take his place. There was no fixed term, no election, no orderly succession. There was only the ongoing fact of holding the position against whoever came to take it. James George Frazer opened the Golden Bough with this priesthood in 1890 because it posed a question he found genuinely interesting. What kind of religious logic produces this arrangement, and what does the arrangement tell us about the traditions that maintained it? The questions he asked have remained productive for scholars in the century, and more since the book appeared, even where his specific answers have been reconsidered or set aside. The Rex Nemorentis is strange, the practice is strange, and the strangeness is worth sitting with rather than quickly resolved, because the practice appears to have been genuinely maintained over a long period at a significant cult site by a community that took the goddess and her sacred grove seriously. What the Rex Nemorensis arrangement suggests, at minimum, is that the sacred space of Diana Nemorensis' grove at Nimi was understood to require a particular kind of guardianship, a guardianship that was ongoing, tested, and embodied in a single human figure who was entirely defined by his ability to hold his position against challenge. The grove needed a king, and the kingship was not ceremonial. It was a continuous act of defense, performed in the sacred space itself, among the trees and beside the dark water, under the authority of a goddess whose defining characteristics included the protection of boundaries and the governance of wild spaces that operated by different rules than the spaces outside them. Lake Nimi is quiet now. The water inside the crater still reflects the tree line with the precision that the volcanic bowl's enclosure produces. A mirror of the forest, slightly darkened by the depth of the water, completely still on a windless day. The grove at the water's edge is not what it was in antiquity, and the Rex Nemorensis, who once walked armed among those trees, is a figure preserved now in texts and in the long scholarly argument that Frazer's book generated, not in any living practice. But the lake itself holds its position inside its crater, and the quality of enclosure that made it feel like a place set apart from the ordinary world has not changed with the ending of the cult that used to acknowledge that quality in ritual form. The theological framework that placed lakes and groves and mountain slopes under divine authority was not unique to the Greek and Roman traditions. It appears in different forms across many of the religious traditions of the ancient Mediterranean and the wider ancient world. But the Greek encoding of this framework through the concept of the temenos, the formally cut space, the ground that has been separated from common use by the deliberate act of drawing a boundary, gives it a particular clarity and precision. The temenos was not simply a place where a deity was thought to be present. It was a legal structure, a piece of land that had been removed from the category of ordinary land by an act with recognized religious and civic force. The deity's presence was a consequence of the cutting, not merely a belief attached to a landscape feature. In the cult of Artemis, the outdoor temenos often enclosed spaces that had a prior quality of wildness, a spring, a grove, a forested hillside, rather than creating a sacred space out of ground that would otherwise be ordinary. The cutting did not produce the sacred quality from nothing. It acknowledged and formalized a quality that was understood to be already present. The spring was already a place where something divine was happening, where water was moving from the earth in the way that the Greek religious imagination understood as an act with theological content. The cutting said, "This is recognized, this is bounded, this is held within a structure that the human community agrees to respect." This is a different understanding of sacred space than the one that places the divine inside a building, behind walls, inside a room where a cult statue stands and priests perform rites on behalf of a community that remains outside. In the outdoor temenos, the sacred is not enclosed and protected from the ordinary world. The ordinary world is excluded from a space that the divine already inhabits, and the boundary marker says, not this is where the god is kept, but this is where the god is and where you are not, unless you approach with the acknowledgement that the space requires. The high forested zones of Mount Taygetos operated as this kind of space in the Laconian religious understanding. The upper slopes were not marked with temenos stones in the way that a smaller dedicated enclosure might be. They were simply understood to be that kind of territory, the kind that the goddess governed, the kind that operated by her rules, the kind that you entered on different terms than the valley. The scale of the mountain made the formal act of cutting unnecessary. The mountain itself was the boundary. The tree line was the threshold. And above the tree line, in the zones where the forest gave way to bare limestone, and the air was thinner, and the sound of the valley was entirely gone, the governance of the ordinary human world had already ended, and you were in hers. The Greek word for this quality of the wild, agrios, appears in the sources in many contexts. A wild animal is agrios, untamed land is agrios. A person who behaves without civilized restraint is sometimes called agrios. But the theological use of the word carries something more than these everyday applications. When ancient writers describe a mountain or a forest as agrios in a religious context, they are describing a place that is inhabited by a divine presence that has not been domesticated by human use, a presence that is genuinely wild in the same way that the landscape is genuinely wild, operating by its own logic, not available for human purposes without proper acknowledgement. Artemis was the goddess of this quality, not the goddess of a tamed and managed version of it, not the goddess of wilderness that has been made safe for human passage, but the goddess of the thing itself, the high mountain before anyone has built a path up it, the spring before anyone has built a channel to carry its water down to the valley, the forest before anyone has counted the timber in it. The ancient sources are consistent in placing her in these spaces before human activity has reorganized them, and in marking her as the authority that any human movement through such spaces needed to reckon with. The practical religious expression of this was the acknowledgement that entering wild spaces required. Before a hunter entered the forest, he might leave an offering at a boundary point, a small gift of food, a portion of his previous catch, a ritual gesture that said, I know whose ground I am entering, and I am entering it correctly. Before a traveler crossed through a mountain pass, there might be a wayside shrine at the highest point, a place to stop and acknowledge the deity whose territory the pass crossed. The acknowledgement was not fear, exactly, though the consequences of failing to give it were understood to be real. It was closer to the acknowledgement of an authority that was genuinely present and genuinely in charge of the space you were moving through, the same kind of acknowledgement that any traveler makes when entering territory that belongs to someone else. The mountains of the Greek interior, in this understanding, were never simply landscape, they were jurisdictions, and Artemis held the highest of them, and the wildest, and the ones where the quality of the wilderness was most fully itself, where no human arrangement had organized the terrain into something manageable, where the pine and fir and limestone were doing what they had always done, following the rules of their own growth and their own season, answering to no authority but the one that had governed them since before the human world began to take an interest in them. Across the Aegean from the Greek mainland, on the island of Lesbos and in the coastal territories of Ionia, and further east into the landscapes of Asia Minor, the goddess's authority extended into terrain that was different in character from the limestone mountains of the Peloponnese, but continuous in its wildness, olive silver hillsides, river deltas where the land was still being built by the water that carried silt down from the mountains, salt marshes at the edge of the sea, where the boundary between water and land shifted with the tide and was never entirely stable. These marginal territories, the spaces between categories, neither fully land nor fully sea, neither cultivated plain nor wild mountain, were also understood to be under her governance, and the Greek religious imagination was consistent in placing her at boundaries and thresholds of every kind. This is one of the oldest patterns in her cult. Artemis as the goddess of the threshold, the figure who presides over passages between states, between the wild and the tame, between the human world and the animal world, between the controlled and the uncontrolled. The outdoor temenos, with its boundary stone marking the line between ordinary ground and sacred ground, was a physical embodiment of this pattern. The stone said, "Here is a threshold, and the goddess is on the other side of it, in the space that belongs to her, governing according to her own arrangements." And the stone was placed in the ground and left there, and the grass grew up to its edge on both sides. Some of these stones have been in the ground for 2,000 years or more. The cult practices that placed them there have ended, and the communities that maintain those practices have been replaced by other communities with different religious lives. And the gods to whose authority the stones referred have not been worshipped in any continuous tradition for many centuries. And yet the stones remain in the ground, and the grass continues to grow up to their edges, and the hillsides on which they stand continue to produce their wild flowers in spring, and their dry grass in summer, and their smell of wet limestone in autumn, and the quality of the landscape that the stone was placed to mark, the quality that the ancient Greek religious understanding called agrios, belonging to the wild, inhabited by a presence not available for ordinary human use, has not been extracted from the hills by the ending of the cult. The wild endures, not in the theological sense that the ancient tradition would have used to describe it. The goddess is not worshipped on Taygetos. The Rex Nemorensis does not walk armed in the grove at Nemi. The boundary stones do not mark and actively maintain temenos that any living community has cut from the common ground and dedicated to a deity. But the limestone of the high ridgelines continues to change color through the day in the way it always has. The water of Lake Nemi continues to reflect the tree line with the precision of a mirror. The forests of the Arcadian interior continue to produce their particular silence, the kind that settles in around you when the sounds of the valley have faded and you are above the last human arrangement and into the zone where the land is doing something other than what you asked of it. The tradition that named this quality and placed a goddess over it has ended in its active form. But the naming was accurate. The wild is not empty. It was not empty when the boundary stones were placed, and it is not empty now. Something continues in those spaces that the human world enters on different terms than the ones that govern the valley below. Something that the Greek religious imagination was trying to describe when it said agrios, when it drew the line of the Temenos through a hillside and placed a flat stone in the ground and said, "Here is the threshold, and on the other side of it, a different authority is in charge." From the valley floor below Sparta, early in the morning, when the air is still and the Eurotas moves quietly between its reeds, the ridgeline of Taygetos holds its pale blue before the sun arrives. The color is brief. It does not last much past the first quarter hour of full dawn, when the light catches the limestone from the east, and the blue is replaced by the white clarity of full daylight. But in that brief window, the mountain holds something that is almost exactly the color of deep water, not the color of the sea in summer, which is bright and declarative, but the color of water in a valley, in shadow, on a cold morning, the color of something very old and very still and in no hurry to be seen clearly. The boundary stone sits half buried in the hillside above the valley. The grass has grown up to it on both sides, which is how grass grows, to the edge of the thing and stops there, and along the edges of the thing, as close to it as growing things get when they grow beside stone. The line the stone marks is still legible in the ground if the light is right. From above, looking down the slope, you can see where the ground changes quality on either side of the stone, not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself, but in the way that ground always changes when something has been holding its position in it long enough to affect the drainage and the growth and the small arrangements of soil and root around it. The stone has been in the ground through every season that has passed over this hillside. It was placed here by hands that understood what the placing meant, and it has kept its position through everything that has changed around it, and the grass grows up to its edge and stops there, patient as anything that has found the right place and simply stayed. On the slope of Mount Catharon, in Boeotia, there is a spring. It is small enough that a person could step across it at its narrowest point, hillside, and it sits in a hollow of the hillside, where the trees have grown close enough together that the light reaching it in the afternoon comes through at an angle, broken into pieces by the canopy, never quite settling on the surface of the water long enough to warm it. The sound of it is continuous and quiet. The pool it collects into before spilling down the slope is ringed by moss that is very green and very cold to the touch, and the stone beneath the moss is pale and smooth. It is the kind of place that exists on many forested hillsides, unremarked, the kind of place a person might pass within 20 feet of and never know it was there. There is nothing about the water itself, or the hollow it fills, or the trees that lean above it, that announces anything at all. The story, when it arrives, changes what the place is without changing anything about it. Actaeon was a hunter. He was trained in the art by Chiron, the centaur who served as teacher to several of the figures. The Greek tradition thought it worth preserving, and he was understood to be skilled at the work. A man who knew what tracking required, who knew the mountains, who had the dogs to do the job, and the patience to let them. He was out on Kytheron, in the account that Ovid preserves in the Metamorphoses, hunting through the morning, and by the time the afternoon heat had come on and the hunting had wound down for the day, he found himself walking through unfamiliar ground, not lost. A hunter who knew his work would not be lost on a mountain, he knew, but in that particular hour of the afternoon, with the light falling the way it falls through dense trees and the heat making everything quiet, he was walking without a fixed direction, and the spring was there before he expected it. What he found was the goddess bathing. Artemis was in the pool with her nymphs, their weapons and their garments set to one side, the small enclosed space of the hollow entirely given over to that particular unguarded hour. Ovid describes the moment with the precision of someone noting the geometry of a collision, two trajectories that had nothing to do with each other and everything to do with each other, arriving at the same point at the same moment, neither of them having chosen it. Actaeon had not been looking. Artemis had not been waiting. The hollow had simply opened in front of him, the way hollows on forested hillsides open, and he had stepped into it. The tradition holds that Artemis responded immediately. She reached into the pool she was standing in and threw water at his face, and while the water was still moving through the air, she spoke the words that completed what the water had begun. Ovid gives them plainly. Now tell, if you can, that you saw me unclothed. The account does not frame this as rage in the way that word usually works. It is something colder and more precise than rage, the instant enforcement of a boundary that had always existed, a correction being applied. What the water carried was not a punishment in the sense of a response to wrongdoing. What it carried was a change in kind. Actaeon had seen something that no mortal was meant to see, not because the goddess was modest in any human sense, but because what she was in that moment was not available to the mortal gaze. The water landed, and the man who had entered the hollow became something else. The transformation that Ovid describes is detailed. The antlers came first, spreading out from his forehead while he was still standing, still himself, still knowing what he was even as what he was changed under him. His neck lengthened, his hands became hooves. His skin moved and settled into something different. The dogs who had been waiting at the edge of the hollow while he walked ahead found the stag he had become and did what they had been trained to do. Ovid names some of them: Blackfoot, Spot, Tigress, Blackcoat, among others, a list that has struck many readers over the centuries as unusually specific, unusually careful, as though naming the hounds that destroyed their master was a way of accounting for them, of making sure their part in the story was recognized. They were not to blame. They knew nothing about what they were doing, except that they were doing what they had always done. What the story holds at its center is not cruelty, exactly, and the tradition does not invite the reader to experience it as cruelty. It holds something more structural, thorns and koldapochenik spot. Persichok vitritive, and when the reader of Munner wops, and you can to Jefferson Ewing told Mongli, puri krempel avsted pausabesiuger wid, in which reader of Mun confirmation, and simply tremble oft saying, Vorjaltri, and ignored dark. The idea that there are places and moments that exist outside the reach of the ordinary human claim to look and to know, and that the wilderness Artemis governed was one of those places, and that entering it without the right understanding of what it was had consequences that the tradition regarded as logical rather than monstrous. The spring on Kithaeron is still there, or something enough like it, that travelers have identified places on that mountain with the story for a very long time. The pool is still small. The light still comes through the trees at an angle. None of that has changed. Orion's story is older and more contested than Actaeon's, and the ancient sources never quite settled on what it was. He was a giant hunter from Boeotia, which is itself suggestive, a figure from the same landscape as Actaeon, from the same tradition of men who were extraordinarily good at the work of the hunt, and who found themselves, through routes that different sources describe differently, inside the territory that the goddess held. Some versions of the tradition hold that Orion and Artemis were companions, that they hunted together across whatever landscape the gods and the figures who moved beside them occupied, and that something like affection existed between them. Some versions hold that he attempted violence against the goddess or against one of her nymphs, and that what came after was a response to that. The tradition does not close around a single explanation, and the ancient sources preserved in the scholarly record disagree too openly to allow any single account to stand as definitive. What most versions agree on is the manner of his death, or at least one of its shapes. In the account in which Apollo arranges the end, the god challenges Artemis to hit a distant object moving in the sea, something she can barely make out from the shore. She is a perfect shot, and she knows it, and the challenge is not difficult to accept on those terms. She draws and looses, and what she has hit when she goes to sea is Orion. The tradition does not specify what she felt when she understood what she had done. Ovid and other sources acknowledge that she grieved him, or that something in the tradition acknowledged a grief without quite naming it directly. She placed him among the stars. That much nearly all the versions agree on. Whatever the story holds about who Orion was to Artemis, or who he failed to be, or what he did or did not do, the ending is the same. The constellation that bears his name holds its position in the winter sky. The stars above Boeotia in winter hold Orion in the same arrangement they have always held him, the three belt stars precisely spaced, the whole figure vast and familiar against the dark. Ancient Greek observers who looked up at those stars knew the story, or one of the stories, and the constellation carries that knowing forward without being changed by it. Orion is there in December, as he has always been in December, enormous and still, the belt marking the celestial equator with a precision no human geographer ever managed. The myth gave the figure its name. The stars gave the myth its permanence. Callisto's story belongs to Arcadia, where she was a companion of Artemis, one of the nymphs bound by the same vow the goddess had asked of all her retinue. She was from the region itself, Arcadian by origin, the daughter in some versions of Lycaon, which connects her to one of the darker threads of Arcadian mythology, in a way the tradition does not always foreground when telling her particular story. What the tradition does foreground is the vow and what happened to it. Zeus found her resting alone, and the account that follows is not one the tradition handles uniformly. Some versions are more explicit, some more circumspect, but the consequence in all of them is the same. Her vow had been broken, not by her own choice, and when the evidence of what had happened became visible, the discovery was made in the way these discoveries always seem to be made in the myth world, at a bathing pool, with the other companions present, with Artemis herself there to see. The transformation came then, in most versions, though the ancient sources vary on who performed it. In some accounts it was Artemis who made Callisto a bear, enforcing the terms of the broken vow. In others it was Hera, reacting to her husband's infidelity with the particular targeting of the woman, rather than the man that the tradition of Hera's jealousy follows in so many of its stories. In still others, Zeus himself performed the transformation in an attempt to hide what had happened, which has the characteristic logic of divine self-interest that the Greek tradition applied to its gods without apparent irony. What all the accounts hold is the bear, Callisto moving through the Arcadian landscape in the form she had been given, the mountains she had always known, now known differently, from closer to the ground in the particular registers of smell and sound that a bear uses. Her son Arcas, born from what Zeus had done to her, grew up not knowing what his mother had become. The tradition holds that he encountered the bear in the forest and was about to kill her, not knowing, the account is careful to establish, not knowing at all, when Zeus intervened. He placed them both among the stars. Callisto became Ursa Major, the great bear of the northern sky. Arcas became the neighboring constellation, and in some traditions, his name is where the name of the region comes from. Arcadia, the country of Arcas, the son of the bear. The geography and the myth are wound together so tightly in the tradition that it is difficult to say where one ends and the other begins, which is perhaps what the tradition intended. The bear that moves through a forested hillside at dusk moves with the particular unhurried purpose that bears carry when nothing is threatening them and they know where they are going. The motion of it is settled and continuous, the ground yielding slightly under the weight, the underbrush opening and closing again behind. The Arcadian mountains in late afternoon hold that kind of movement in a landscape that has always been the kind of landscape where such movement belongs. Steep-sided valleys, dense oak forest, the sound of water from somewhere below, whether the figure in the trees is a bear or a transformation or a constellation's origin, or simply an animal on a hillside moving toward wherever it was going before the story found it. The motion is the same. The motion continues. Niobe stands apart from the other stories. The tradition tells in the register of Artemis, because what Niobe did had nothing to do with the wilderness, with bathings in woodland springs, with the territory the goddess held. What Niobe did was simpler, and from the tradition's perspective, more straightforward in its transgression. She was a queen. She was proud of her children in the way that the Greek tradition understood pride, to be capable of crossing a boundary, not the everyday pride of a parent, but pride carried to the point where it became a claim. She had 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters, and she said aloud and in public that this made her superior to Leto, who had only 2. The tradition records this as the kind of statement that once made could not be unmade. Leto had 2, and the 2 she had were Apollo and Artemis. The response came swiftly in the mythological account, which preserves no interval of patience or warning. Apollo descended on the sons. Artemis descended on the daughters. The silver arrows that the tradition associated with Artemis, that she had asked for as a child sitting on the knee of Zeus, that the Cyclopes had made for her at the forge on Lipara, served the same function in this story that they served across the tradition, not as weapons of the hunt in the sense of chasing something through undergrowth, but as instruments of the precise distant correction that the bow allowed. 7 sons, 7 daughters. The tradition gives their names in some versions: Sipylus, Agenor, Pheidimus, Ismenius, Tantalos, Alphenor, Damasic Thorn, among the boys, Asteria, Pelopia, Phthia, Niobe the Younger, and others among the girls, though the lists vary across sources, which is typical of the tradition's handling of secondary figures who are present in a myth primarily for what their destruction demonstrates. Niobe's grief was, the tradition holds, total, a grief that had nowhere to go because it was complete, because there was nothing left of what she had been proud of, because the pride and the grief had the same object and the object was gone. The myth gives her transformation the register of a natural consequence rather than an additional punishment. She wept until she was stone, or until she wept so continuously that what she had become was simply the thing that wept, the form the weeping took when it had been going long enough. The rock on Mount Sipylus in Lydia, that ancient travelers identified as Niobe's monument, is a real geological feature, a pale limestone fissure from which water runs steadily, the moisture darkening the rock face in a shape that observers across many centuries read as a figure weeping. Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century, describes going to see it and finding it as described. The water runs from the rock on Mount Sepilus today, as it has always run, steady and continuous, the sound of it quiet and unchanging. There is something in the tradition's geography of consequence that deserves a moment of attention, though the tradition itself does not tend to offer it explicitly. Actaeon becomes part of the landscape of Cithaeron. Niobe becomes part of the landscape of Sipylus. Callisto and her son become part of the sky above Arcadia. The myth does not move the consequence to a distant place. It folds the person into the landscape where the thing happened, or into the sky above the place they were known, and leaves them there permanently. The mountain holds Niobe. The stars hold Callisto. The spring on Callitheron holds a version of Actaeon that the moss and the pale stone and the cold water have been carrying forward through every season since the story was first told. Among the stories that cluster around this tradition, Cypriotes is the least known and the most quietly interesting. The account survives only in a scholion, a marginal commentary on Callimachus, which means it was recorded not as a main text, but as an explanatory note attached to someone else's work. Sorbriotes was young. He was Cretan. He came across the goddess bathing, as Actaeon had come across the goddess bathing, and the tradition holds that what followed was different in ways the scholarly record has found worth examining at some length. He was not transformed into an animal. He was not killed. He was transformed into a girl. The tradition offers no extended explanation of this. The scholion records it without elaborating on why the response to this particular witnessing was this particular change, rather than the animal form or the arrow that the other accounts supply. Scholars who have examined the story have noted the youth of Sorbriotes as one factor that the tradition may have distinguished between a boy who had not yet reached the threshold of full adult male identity and a grown man, between an accidental witness who posed no ongoing threat and a figure who would need to be more permanently resolved. Others have pointed to the possibility of specific Cretan cult practice around Artemis, practices that may have involved gender in ways that the mainland tradition did not preserve in legible form. The story is small, and the evidence for it is thin. What it holds at its most basic level was the suggestion that the range of responses available to the goddess was wider than the more familiar accounts imply, that the territory she governed had room for outcomes that were not destruction, that the encounter with the sacred could produce transformations that were neither punitive in a simple sense, nor without their own particular quality of strangeness. What all these stories together hold is a single recurring structure, a boundary, a crossing, a change that makes the boundary permanently visible. The spring on Callitheron is a spring until it becomes the place where Actaeon stepped forward and the world shifted around him, and after that it is both things at once, a small pool of cold water on a forested hillside, and a place where the rule about what mortals may see was enforced in the most literal way the tradition could manage. The mountains of Arcadia are mountains until they become the landscape where the chase between the divine and the human was most frequently staged, and after that they are both things too. The rock on Sorpylus runs with water, and it is a geological feature, and it is also the thing that Niobe became when the weeping outlasted the form it had been contained in. The tradition does not ask the listener to resolve these doubles into one reading. The spring is the spring, and it is the story. The rock is the rock, and it is the grief. Both are true in the Greek world as the tradition constructed it, and the tradition held them side by side without apparent difficulty for as long as anyone was paying attention to it. The night sky holds all of this together in a way that the stories themselves cannot quite manage, because the stories are spread across different landscapes and different sources and different moments in the long calendar of the tradition's transmission, but the stars are always in the same arrangement above all of them. Orion stands in the winter sky above Boeotia, above Arcadia, above Lydia, above Crete. The constellation does not know that there are different stories about how it got there. It holds its position through December and through January, the belt stars marking the same line they have always marked, the whole figure, patient and enormous against whatever darkness the night provides. Ursa Major turns above the northern horizon through the whole year in the latitudes where the Greek tradition was most alive, never setting, never dipping below the edge of the world. It was circumpolar, always visible, always in motion, always completing the long circuit that carries it from one part of the sky to another, and back again through the course of a single night. Ancient Greek observers who watched those 7 stars knew what they called the figure they made, the bear, the great bear, moving through the sky above Arcadia in the same unhurried way that bears move through forested hillsides at dusk, purposeful and at home. Callisto had known Arcadia from the ground, as a nymph who ran with the goddess across its mountain slopes, and then had known it differently, from closer to the ground, with different senses, in the form the transformation had given her. Now she knew it from above, or the sky that bore her name and her shape did, which the tradition understood as a kind of continuation, even if it was a continuation that looked nothing like what had come before it. The stars above Arcadia in the middle of the night are very far away and very steady. They do not flicker the way stars closer to the horizon do, shaken by the weight of atmosphere they have to travel through to reach an observer's eye. The circumpolar stars burn with something that approaches constancy, which is perhaps why the tradition chose them as the place to put figures whose stories were in some sense about the permanence of what had happened to them. Callisto will not unbecome the bear. The transformation is not reversible, but placed among the stars, the irreversibility becomes a kind of dwelling, a permanent address in the sky above the place where the transformation occurred. There is something in the way Artemis moves through all these stories that is worth holding for a moment in the quiet before sleep comes, because she is never the same kind of presence twice. In the account of Actaeon, she is the thing that enforces the boundary, the correction that the situation required. In the story of Orion, she may be the grieving one, the figure who shot without knowing what she was shooting, who placed among the stars a being whose relationship to her the tradition never quite resolved. In the myth of Callisto, she is the one who discovers the broken vow. Some sources hold that she performed the transformation herself, others that she was simply present when it happened, or perhaps absent when it was performed by Hera, the accounts shifting around her like water around a stone. In the story of Niobe, she is the precise instrument of a consequence that the tradition regarded as proportionate, 7 arrows for 7 daughters, in a mythology that understood proportion as one of the names of justice. In the small and marginal story of Cypriotes, something different again, a response that changed rather than destroyed, a transformation that moved toward rather than away. The goddess moves through these stories without simplifying into a type. She is not only the avenger, not only the guardian, not only the huntress, standing at the edge of the world with her silver bow. She is all of these, and also the figure on the floor of the hollow in Kithaeron, who had been bathing with her companions in the only unguarded hour of an otherwise alert existence, who reached into the water without particular ceremony and applied the only correction available. She is the one who placed Orion in the sky, whatever she felt about the placing. She is the one whose vow her companion broke without choosing to, and who is implicated in the consequence, whatever version of the story is telling it. The myths do not protect her from complexity. They just hold the complexity in the particular forms that mythological time and mythological space provide, which are permanent and not easily revised. The mountains she was given are still the mountains they were. The Arcadian interior still holds its steep valleys and its forested ridges in the same arrangement, the rivers running where they have always run, the sky visible from the valley floors with the same geometry of stars it has carried since before the tradition found words to describe it. Mount Taygetos still rises above the Eurotas Valley in the same pale limestone configuration that ancient travelers noted, and modern travelers still see, when the light is right, the ridgeline changing color through the morning, moving from gray to white to the particular warm color of limestone in the afternoon sun, and then back to gray as the evening comes on. The mountains do not remember what happened in them, they simply continue, but the stories remember. The spring on Kithaeron is small and cold and very quiet in the afternoon hour when the light comes through the trees at an angle. The surface of the pool is still, or almost still, disturbed only by the water coming in from the hillside above, which sends out very small rings that travel outward and then dissolve before they reach the edge of the moss. The sound of the water is continuous and uniform and not loud enough to hear from more than a short distance. And from that distance, in the right afternoon light, the place looks entirely ordinary. A hollow on a forested hillside, a pool, trees, the smell of water and leaf matter, and the cold that lives at the back of all shaded places in the mountains, even in summer. The myths of trespass and transformation that cluster around Artemis are very old, and the distance between them and the present moment is considerable, and that distance is itself a kind of rest. These are not things that are happening. They are things that happened, or that the tradition held as having happened, in a cosmological past where the gods were still actively present in the landscape in ways that were immediate and accountable. That world is not this world, and the distance between them is not alarming. It is simply there, the way the distance between any two things is simply there, legible and not pressing. The stars do not share the distance problem, because the stars are still the same stars. Orion is in the winter sky now, as he was in the winter sky when Ovid wrote about him, and when the first story about him was told in whatever form that first story took before it was written down. The belt stars hold the same spacing they have always held, 3 points of light on the celestial equator, visible from almost every inhabited place on the Earth's surface that is not too close to one of the poles. The figure they are part of is enormous in the winter sky, the largest and most immediately recognizable of the named constellation patterns,